All right, everybody. Thank you and welcome to our meeting. This is our October trainings for the Iowa Heartland Chapter of SCTE. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. And we have a couple of people joining us online too. So thank you for their participation. I'm Curtis Dean with the Iowa Heartland Chapter. Before we get rolling here with our first topic, which is NextGen TV, I have a couple of housekeeping items to address for everybody. First of all, we have another training coming up here in a couple of weeks. It's called Customer Premise Wi-Fi. This is a virtual training. It's online. We have both a morning session and an afternoon session. So the morning session's at 9 a.m. The afternoon session is at 1. Gabriel Reyes from Comtrend will be our trainer. Gabriel's done this for us before and does a really nice job. He's going to really be zeroing in on customer premise Wi-Fi, mesh networking, Wi-Fi 6, and some of the impacts that Wi-Fi 6 will have on how you deploy customer Wi-Fi. So you can see down at the bottom of the screen there, that's our website. And all of these trainings that I talk about, you go to our website, iowaheartlandscte.org, and go to the events and training page. And that's where you'll find the links to these trainings. So if you aren't signed up for this one already, please do so. Again, 2 sessions, so pick which one. It'll be a repeat, so you don't need to do both. And that's coming up on Wednesday, October 26th. So it's 2 weeks from today. We are still working on a training on CBRS. Terry and from our board, Terry is working with another board member, Deshaun, to put all that together. It's likely to be online, and we're looking at having a morning and afternoon session for that. CBRS is the one of the new wireless standards that is being used by operators to deploy a fixed wireless service in hard to reach areas. And so a lot of operators are deploying it now. There are a lot more to come, and you're going to learn more about that and how that fits into your plans as a cable operator or a broadband operator about how you can use it to extend your service territory. And our final training of the year is scheduled for Tuesday, December 13th. It's called the Evolution of IP Television. It will also be an online session, and we also have 2 sessions, morning and afternoon, 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. Our featured speakers are Emily Call. She's with Midwest Video Solutions. We'll also have Jean Edlund, who is with Cooperative Network Services. Some of you might know Jean anyway. She had a long career with Fox Sports Midwest or Fox Sports North back in the day. She now works for Cooperative Network Services, and she essentially manages programming for a bunch of cable operators. So she's been through this drill before of cable operators who have transitioned from RF cable to IPTV, and now some of them are transitioning to more of a bring your own device over the top IPTV. And so she's going to talk about what that process looks like for the cable operator. Emily is with MVS, and she's going to talk about how internet protocol television has evolved and how it started in the days with everything was proprietary middleware, proprietary set-top boxes. Everything was expensive and hard to get, to now to the point where a cable operator could offer an over-the-top version of their cable lineup to anybody with a Roku device or a Fire TV or an Apple TV device. So it's a really cool topic. We wanted to do it earlier in the year. We just couldn't get it off the ground. So please, again, go to that same website, our trainings and event page at iowaheartlandscte.org, get registered, and join us for that on December 13th. And mark your calendars. Yay. We were going to do a vendor day today, but we kind of ran up into a conflict with the MATS show down in Kansas City. A lot of our vendors just were like, I can't clone myself and be in both places. So we've postponed with the vendor day we were going to have today, and it's now going to be on March 23rd. That's a Thursday. It's going to be right here in this room, so you know where to go. 8:30 to 11:30. So the vendors will be setting up either the morning before or the day in the morning of, and goes to 11:30. So we may be doing an afternoon training. Haven't settled with that yet. The board's going to talk about whether we couple this with a training in the afternoon. But we do want to make sure you mark your calendars for that. And we are expecting a really good vendor turnout for this. It's the day after the Iowa Communication Alliance, you know, the little independence guys, after they have their show. So we think a lot of vendors will be excited to stay in town one extra day and be able to be in front of a slightly different group. So that's what we got going on the training schedule. And again, that's all available on our website. All right. So now we're going to get to the main event, and that is this morning's training session. I'm excited to introduce to you Skip Pizzi and Dave Folsom. I'll let them tell you a little bit about themselves first, and then we'll get going. I think Dave's going to go first. So Dave, I'll have you introduce yourself, and then Skip, introduce yourself, and we'll go back to Dave then for his part of the presentation.
Hello, my name is Dave Folsom, and I'm a engineer that works for Pearl TV, and we'll get into a little bit of what Pearl TV is and what it's about in my presentation. But we are mostly focused on NextGen television, ATSC3, based in ATSC3 standard, and we try to act as an outward-facing to the viewers face for the promotion of NextGen TV, but from an engineering point of view, we face inward towards the industry, both the manufacturers of equipment and receivers, but also to our own constituencies that fund us to get the transition going from our current standard ATSC1 in the United States to ATSC3. So that's about all I can tell you about myself, but we'll talk a little about ATSC3 and Pearl more here in the presentation. Do you want me to get started, or I think you want to introduce Skip first, right?
Go ahead and have Skip say hi quick. Did you hear that?
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me all okay? Okay. Hi, yes, I'm Skip Pizzi, consultant based in the Philadelphia area, PA, and working on, I've been the vice chair of ATSC's TG3, Technology Group 3, which has been the body that's been developing the ATSC standard from its inception about 10 plus years ago. And so pretty familiar with, at least at a high level, pretty much all that ATSC3 encompasses, which is a vast area of end to end, from essence encoding all the way to RF delivery. So it's a lot, and there's a lot of specialists who drill down into each one of those areas, hundreds of companies and people that have contributed to this. And so it's been a real thrill, honor, and a learning experience to work with all of them over the years. And now the standard's being deployed in multiple countries, South Korea, US, of course, but also now Jamaica has selected it. We're about to hear about from probably at least one more Caribbean country very soon, and Brazil is considering it, has selected some components of it already, and is still testing some others, and I'm involved with that particular engagement to get Brazil on board. Also working on the New York City transition, which is, of course, probably the toughest one in the US to do, given the density of that market. So involved with both domestic and international ATSC3 deployment. So talk a little bit, try to fill in probably the very few gaps that Dave will leave with you on his introduction, which having looked at his slides already looks really thorough. And so you're in for a treat there. I'll pass it back to Dave. Thanks.
Okay, to get started, I want to tell you a little about what we're going to be talking about today. As Skip points out, ATSC3 NextGen TV is a huge subject that is on particularly when you're first introduced to it, in your mindset is prior transmission systems. It's a shock because the language is different, the terminology, the mechanics of how it works are different. So I'm going to give you a very, 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 very high level introduction, because in the time allotted, you could spend a week or more drilling down into this to get more. But hopefully we'll kind of increase your appetite to learn more. And I'm going to give you some information about how you can learn more. What are we going to talk about? Obviously, I'm going to introduce what Pearl TV is. I'll give you a quick overview and a very quick overview of the standard, more of a taste than an overview. Status of the transition, because I think particularly with our MVP PD partners, everybody's interested in how quickly it's moving along, because obviously it impacts right now. I think 70+% of our coverage is with MVPDs, and we consider you our partners, and I know that you're very interested in how fast this transition will happen. The status of the consumer receivers, because it's a chicken and egg issue. We can transmit all day long. If there isn't enough receivers out there, then we don't have an audience. NextGen TV security, which is something you may or may not have been, about, but I'll give you a taste of what that is. Transitioning a market, mechanical, how that happens. I think Skip is also going to talk to that as well. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but impact to MVPDs and redistribution. Again, I think Skip is, I've seen his slides and has excellent backgrounder on that, and what ATSC did as an organization to try to speak to those issues. And the Run TV application, or interactive viewer experience, which is a big part, I believe, of what NextGen TV can provide. What is Pearl? Well, Pearl is a business consortium, and it represents the interests of about 800 TV stations through their ownership of big companies like Scripps and Hearst and Nexstar and Sinclair and others, who essentially have banded together to support technologies that could obviously enhance the business. And it's not just a technology organization, but it's also kind of a means by which, if a technology is selected, it can provide a promotional platform to get the rest of the ecosystem to make use of that capability. And we've dealt with a mobile delivery of content in the past. We've had initiatives in the areas of traffic and advanced advertising. And in parallel, we'll also are trying to promote the rollout of ATSC3 NextGen TV. Here's my shameless plug. There's a thing called a host station manual, which I authored. I think it's in revision 12 right now. I'm working on 13, and it's available free. How about that? That's a cost you cannot refuse, and it's available at that website shown at the bottom of the screen, www.pearltv.com, and then under station resources, you can find this manual, the most current version of it. It's about 200 and something pages long. Believe it or not, as long as it is, it still is not. It's written in a popular manner to make it easier to understand. And as we'll see, the actual standard itself is well over 1,000 pages. So, but this talks about everything from transitioning markets to the mechanics of ATSC3 and how it works. Give you a quick overview of the standard. It provides a high quality video, audio, and interactive video experience. That's a very high level. It's modern, global in nature, television standard that has been developed both by the companies that are going to be building the equipment, the broadcasters, and it makes use heavily of the internet technology ecosystem, which is really, I think, important and helped really make the standard more affordable in a lot of ways. As Skip mentioned, it's been adopted in the US. South Korea was the first to get on the air with it to cover the 2017 Olympics in Korea. And Jamaica recently went on the air for the first time earlier this year. And they're very excited. They're making a switch all the way from analog all the way to here. They did not stop at the interim digital standard like we are here in the US. Skip mentioned Brazil, and I know he'll have more to say about that. And it's in process in one form or another in Canada, Mexico. Skip mentioned the other Caribbean nations, and also India. They're looking at it in a mobile possibility to go directly to cell phones. The features, the ATSC3 is made up of 22 plus documents, individual documents. They're all available to you free on the ATSC website, and you can download them. They're everything from individual standards to recommended practices and technical reports, and will help you understand it. But again, I wouldn't suggest diving into those right away. Maybe something interim like the host station manual would be a good place to start, to at least become familiar with the way and the architecture, overall architecture of how it works. And then the standards themselves become a little easier to understand, because like I say, the terminology used and language that is assumed that you understand is used heavily in there, and it can be daunting. The single biggest thing I believe in NextGen TV is it's baked into evolvability. We'll get a little into that, but it won't be a one and done, which will require major surgery every time something, the newest and greatest technology comes along. It has the ability to evolve pretty easily, and we'll talk about that. It has the ability not only the over-the-air delivery, but also it has a built-in broadband delivery capability, which is amazingly simple to do. And so that's important. Uses COFDM transmission. You should be familiar with that. It's using Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phones. It's the coding, which is the C in COFDM, is incredibly sophisticated. In the NextGen TV uses LDCP coding, which allows us to reach almost the Shannon limit, which we'll talk about a little. You can transmit in 4 different modulation schemes in a multiplex simultaneously. It has enhanced picture quality, immersive audio with all types of features. And the broadcaster application that's built in uses standard HTML5 W3C underlying programming, which makes it easier for a potential broadcaster to roll out a application in that environment. And it includes content security and service protection. Why am I showing you Matryoshka dolls? Because it kind of helps understand a little bit about how the ATSC3 standard works. You'll notice the 7 dolls there, and that has some significance. If you don't know what a Matryoshka doll is, they're made of wood and they're hollow, and each one of those dolls fits into the next larger one. So you can start with the smallest one, put it in the next one, and so forth. And very much the same with the ATSC3 standard. It makes use of the OSI 7-layer model. Should be familiar to some of you, I would think, because it's the same methodology as DOCSIS, used heavily in cable. And it runs from a physical layer, which would be the transmission media, obviously, all the way up to the application layer, which is the environment in which the presentation, which in the case of television is generally video, audio, and closed captioning. Each one of those layers is wrapped in the layer below. So with a header at the beginning of the wrapping mechanism, which is usually a packet of some type, and that allows the organization of the transmission such that individual layers can be either broken off or changed in the future without impacting the rest of the transmission. So if later on the presentation layer, we figure, well, you know, HEVC is a wonderful high efficiency codec, wouldn't it be great to go to maybe VVC or some other even more efficient codec? We could change that presentation layer codec without really worrying too much about the rest of the transmission chain or stack. So that's a very powerful, and that's at the very base of the evolvability of the system. This is a drill down into the, and I'm not going to go through this because we could spend all day on this, but this is just to show you that that 7-layer stack does exist, all the way from the application layer down to the physical layer. And I know in DOCSIS, for example, they talk about the physical and link layer and transport network layer all the time. So that shows you that there is a parallel. We talked about the Shannon limit. If you're not familiar with the Shannon limit, there was a mathematician who worked at Bell Labs, and I think he was at also MIT. And he was trying to create a mathematical model for a theoretical transmission path. He wasn't really an electrical engineer per se, he was a mathematician. He was just trying to figure out, was there a theoretical limit making use of some type of forward error correction? They didn't, at the time, they didn't call it forward error correction, they called it retransmission. But the issue was, he figured that there had to be a mathematical relationship between what we now call coding and the width of the transmission channel versus how much data you could pass through it at a given signal and noise. So if you knew what the signal and noise was, you could figure out how much data you could pass through it, or in his case, he called it information, and vice versa. There's three interchangeable numbers in this mathematical model, and that created a curve. And if you'll notice, ATSC1, our current transmission standard, because it only had one modulation encoding methodology and it was fixed, has a dot right there. And although it is pretty good in terms of data pass-through or information pass-through, as he would call it, doesn't really approach the Shannon limit, but it's not bad. But move forward 20 plus years and you realize that with a system in which you can change the modulation encoding, which you can in ATSC3, those dots you see there are relatively just some of the possible combinations that you could have in ATSC3. There's tens of thousands, actually, truth be known, but those are enough on there to show you how the picking different modulation encoding allows you to trade a signal and noise threshold, which is along the bottom, versus the capacity. And so you can either have a very robust signal, but trade that for bandwidth, or have a lot of bandwidth and trade that for a transmission distance, if you will, or transmission capacity, pardon me. Noise threshold is something that is an important thing to understand. It's at the very basis of all transmission nowadays, because we used to be signal limited. We're now interference limited in over-the-air transmission. And so here's an example, and it's counterintuitive when you look at it, but if you have a low signal and noise threshold, as in the case of 10 dB shown on the screen there, you actually can transmit quite a distance. In other words, you can decode it even at that threshold. If you have a higher threshold for decoding, then your distance you can transmit is smaller. So I always show this slide because it always seems counterintuitive that lower thresholds have greater delivery distances. This is what the transmission chain looks like, and I'm not going to go through it in detail because it's really time consuming. But each one of those boxes adds to that, each of the layers, starting with because you have to work backwards towards the transmission or the physical layer, starting with the encoding on the left and heading towards the phi layer on the right. Interestingly, all of this is software. All of this transmission equipment, except for the transmitter itself, including the exciter, are nothing more than servers. So these are just off-the-shelf servers running software, because what's going on inside all of these is in the IP domain. So the hardware, although they're powerful servers, there's no real unique hardware in any of these boxes. Here's a little easier way of looking at it. We can, because of the bandwidth we're provided, we can have 25, 26, 27, 28. And I think in Louisville, which I'll show you an example, we had 29 megabits per second worth of bandwidth available on a 6 megahertz channel. We were able to fit 6 services. So 6 different stations were able to partner together and provide their services. So that comes in on the left-hand side. It goes into the encoders. And so there's 6 encoders that encode the video, audio, and closed captioning from those 6. And I show it with a nice little squeeze, if you will, on the to compress it. And they're broken up into ISO BMFF, easy for me to say, segments. If you're familiar with Dash It's a means of allowing to send segments at a time at a higher bit rate so that you can multiplex more easily. It's used extensively in cable, as you probably know. Then moves on to a signaling route encapsulator, and what the route does. Well, let's start with signaling. Signaling is added to tell the receiver how to take apart all the multiplex that's being created in this box. So there has to be a map, if you will, for the receiver, simply stated, to not only find the services, but to find the individual pieces of the video and audio that go together and the closed caption that goes with it. And that's all identifies as objects. And those objects make use of a system that's been around for years called Flute. And there's a special version of Flute called Root, which is what is used by ATSC3. So it's object-based. Then it moves on to the Broadcast Gateway Scheduler. And the Broadcast Gateway Scheduler is kind of like the flow control, if you will, for the transmission, because you have all of this data coming in IP, but it's in different data rates. And it has to be encapsulated in a kind of common bit rate, if you will. That really isn't as accurate as it should be, but it has to be rate shaped, is a better way of saying it. It has to be rate shaped so that it can fit into physical layer packets, which will eventually be transmitted by the transmitter. And so that's what the scheduler does. And it also tells the exciter, if you're using more than one modulation encoding at a time, you can use up for. It schedules which comes when and how they're multiplexed together. Again, I don't want to get too deep into it because it can be a rabbit hole. But the exciter then takes the digital transmission, which has been broken up into packets now, bite-sized packets, and it does a lot of stuff. It creates a QAM constellation, or codes it first, rather. It first adds forward error correction, which is selectable by you. It then makes a QAM constellation out of it that goes through inverse fast forward transform IFFT, and then passes on and is broken up into the output of the IFFT is could be up to thousands of carriers, and the carriers take things that inputs things from the frequency domain into the time domain and vice versa, and that allows the transmission to be covered over the full channel, and then reconstructed back in the receiver, doing the opposite, doing fast forward transform, and then taking the constellation, and the constellation is then decoded. But that's common with CFDM. It's the way Wi-Fi works. It's the way that Bluetooth and other very similar systems work in CFDM. But we can have easily up to 30,000 carriers at one time. So the linearity of the receiver and the linearity of the transmitter is important, and phase stability, obviously. Status of the transition. To date, including Class A's, we have about 55 or so DMAs. It changes daily, so this may be a little dated, a few weeks dated, with 72 stations, with covering 61 million households. I think it's more like 52% of the households right now. And you can read the rest here. We hope to have another 8 stations on before the end of the year, maybe a little more than that, to take us to well over 60% of the US household. And we're pushing very hard for, by 2023, to hit around 70 or 75% of the US households, particularly including those important ones that Skip mentioned, like New York City, which is really critical, because for the economy of broadcasting, getting the largest cities is really critical because of the advertising base. But we've had some good scores. We have Washington, D.C., Boston is going on soon. Miami is about to go on soon, both possibly by the end of this year. In fact, I'm right at the moment they will be on by the end of this year. Los Angeles is on. So we have a lot of good top 10s on already. Dallas is on. So, but we need New York, we need Chicago, we need San Francisco, and we hope those will come about by the end of 2023. This is the same thing, but shown in a map version with what's on the air currently, what is in near-term planning, and meaning that it's either been licensed or the groups, the partnerships have been put together, and they're working on the technical plan. And in the gray are those areas in which there's no final plans yet. Consumer receivers, one of the things I mentioned with Pearl TV is an outreach to all of our constituencies, including viewers. This is www.watchnextgentv.com. The opening screen talks about what receivers might be available. You can, there's a whole series of pages, which I could really go over, but just to understand, if you want to learn more about the consumer experience and how to find a NextGen TV and what manufacturers are making, what models and what those models are and all of that, that's all on watchnextgentv.com, and including a what we call Meet the Johnsons Explainer spot, which is designed to not only show on broadcast air, but also to educate viewers on what NextGen is all about, because we wish the receiver manufacturers do a better job of explaining it, but it's our job as broadcasters to make sure that our viewers understand what the advantages and disadvantages are of NextGen TV. Chip development is really fueling receiver development. There's a number of 3 years ago, there was really only one chip manufacturer that actually had chips in production. We now have quite a number. And these are the two most critical chips that are used. That's by scale, by the way. That's a tuner chip on the left made by Sony. They're not the only manufacturer of tuner chips. All tuner chips that I know of that are manufactured in NextGen TV are also not only NextGen or ATSC3 tuners, but they're also ATSC1 tuner chips as well. So generally speaking, every device that I've seen so far that receives ATSC3 is capable of receiving ATSC1 as well. The chip to the right of that, equally small, little different shape, takes the tuner output, which is straight IP and really nothing else, and starts demultiplexing into the individual services and so forth, and extracts the metadata that is the signaling that I referred to that tells the receiver where things are and how they're to be used, what the channel numbers are, and all of that. What is not shown on here, because you've all seen it before, is an SoC. And an SoC is a kind of more or less generic SoC that's been programmed. It's a computer chip that's programmed to make the receiver act like a receiver, you know, with a display on the screen and decode the video and audio and closed captioning and all of that. A receiver installs, this is a cumulative number, by the way. We got on the air with the first test station with NAB in, I think, 2017, maybe a little earlier than that, 2016. In Cleveland, and then but the actually first licensed station on the air was the Phoenix Test Market station after the in 2018, after the FCC passed their report and order at the end of 2017 to allow broadcasters to voluntarily broadcast. The first TV sets actually were delivered in 2020, but they were pretty much prototypes, but the first commercial sets were in 2021. So you can look at the cumulative, starting with about 3.2 million against maybe 35 million to 45 million TV sets sold a year. And as the audience accumulates, we're hoping in 2025 to reach 59 million. And to put that in context, there is 120 million households, I believe. So that kind of puts it in context, or about we'll be approaching in terms of over-the-air television about 74% of those that are available. And this information came from the Consumer Technology Association, and they tend to be pessimistic. So I think it will actually be better than this. NextGen security, two interesting things. First, in the individual transmission, you probably, particularly now while we're sharing bandwidth, will have a number of services. So you might have an ABC, CBS, NBC, and a Fox, and maybe a PBS, all in the same 6 megahertz channel. Each one of those have the ability to encrypt their signal if they wish. That's allowed under ATSC3, and an authority was set up by Pearl TV called the A3SA, which is managed and directed and governed by the content owners. So they set the rules on how these licenses, these encryption licenses, will work. The encryption credentials come from Widevine. Now there are a number of encryption credential companies out there. We selected Widevine, Pearl did, specifically because as the first, and not the only, but the first, because they had a means by which they could preload licenses into receivers, so that the receivers did not have to be connected to the internet to be ready to decrypt. So the video and audio of each one of those services can, if they want, and I think Tampa is going to be the first on the air with all 5 of their services encrypted. One of them is encrypted already. And along with instructions that go to the receiver to tell how to decrypt what the license is essentially and what the key is. Now that makes sure that the content is protected, but how do you make sure, how does the viewer make sure that what they're receiving over the air is what they think it is, and that there isn't a man in the middle attack? There isn't somebody that is, got a transmitter at the end of their street, which are overwhelming whatever the over-the-air signal is. And that's done using a security certificate. And the methodology is not unlike, it's not identical, but it's not unlike the idea that's used with the World Wide Web right now. If you go to a website at HTTP, if it's an HTTPS site, there's a secure socket that there's a dialogue that goes back and forth between your browser and the website. To ensure that the website is the one you think you're at, and there isn't somebody in between spoofing what's going on. So the signal signing is required by the standard to protect all of the viewers, but the encryption is up to the content owners' decisions and their requirements they may have on the broadcaster. But in all cases, both of these are invisible to the viewer. And people say, well, how does that work? Well, every time you use a Blu-ray device, there's an invisible encryption going on that the viewer likely has no idea that it's encrypted. And I know encryption is widely used in cable, so you should be familiar with the advantages of it. Transitioning market, I think Skip is going to talk about this, but it is a typical mid-sized market. We have 5 willing stations that would like to get on the air with ATSC3, but the FCC didn't give us any more spectrum. So because of the improved efficiencies of HEVC encoding and AC4 encoding, we have the ability to be able to fit those 5 into a single 6 megahertz bandwidth at equal or actually better quality. So what happens is the station that's going to be the host will offload their services because it may be a primary service and a number of what we call D2s or other channels that aren't part of the primary service. Those would be then offloaded to those other stations, and through the virtual numbering that we've been using since the beginning of ATSC1, and when the viewers in the market rescan their receivers, all of their favorite stations will now still be there. They'll still have the same numbers, and it'll be invisible to the viewer that offloading had taken place. And this shows the ATSC3 now on that host station on the right, and the other stations. We'll get into it a little more in a second. Right here. This is an actual location in Louisville. We actually were able to fit 6 stations on WBKI, owned by Block Communications, and that's the host station. After the services that were on WBKI and ATSC1 were offloaded, and is shown in salmon or tan or whatever, however it's rendering on your screen, is shown, for example, their primary service, which was a 720p, shows on WAVE's as a multiplex on their service, and their multicasts, their D2s, are shown on DRB and WLKY. And again, after the market rescans their receivers, everything will go back the way it always was, and the viewer doesn't see the difference. But we've created bandwidth out of whole cloth, if you will, for use in ATSC3 for the primary services anyway, in this particular case, 6. So that does create some problems for cable, and we'll get into that, and Skip will as well. As you probably well know, fiber connectivity is one of the major ways in which broadcasters deliver their signal to MVPDs and VMPDs, usually by MPEG transport stream, but there are other ways. The secondary reception is usually over the air. Although I have run into markets in which the opposite was true. The primary was over the air and the secondary was MPEG transport stream, but that really isn't the point here. The point is that what the transport stream would be to you would not change, because that multiplex is created as if it was the original service, meaning the primary service and the multicasts that are associated with it. But the over the air I've just shown you could be scattered across 3 or 4 stations. So the coordination with a cable is really critical to ensure that when you switch from primary to backup, that there is a means by which you can get from one to the other and not lose where some of the services have gone. And generally speaking, you don't always carry multicast, but you do carry the primary services, and it's easy enough to lose the primary service, and that's not in anybody's best interest. It hurts you and it hurts us. So I know Steve Watkins has given a number of talks. So he's with Cox Cable and has given an excellent presentation on how to get around this and understanding it better. But we work with each cable company. We're required by the FCC rules to notify the market 90 days in advance. That's great for corporate, but we also reach out to the local markets as quickly as we can, and they become part of the transition in every market and attend the calls and are on board when we actually flip the switch to make sure that we don't have problems with losing where the ATSC1 signals go. That's really critical to you and to us. I think Skip's going to talk more about how the ATSC has approached retrans and distribution, redistribution, which is ATSC speak for cable, MVPDs, and all other forms of non-over-the-air transmission. Okay, I mentioned that there was an interactive viewer environment, which is really critical, we believe, for the overall viewer experience to be enhanced through NextGen. Just to keep it straight, there's really 3 layers in modern television sets, and we exploit that. There's a lower layer, which is the normal transmission that you would have. There's a broadcaster app layer that's used both by the receiver during, like when you pull menus up in the smart receiver, that's the broadcaster layer, and it's composited together to create the final thing that the viewer sees. So we have access to that through ATSC3 to that middle layer, that app graphics layer. And so that we can create an environment that exists in that middle layer. And on the right, you can see how we can even change the size and shape of the bottom layer, and we can mask it. So it's a opaque or transparent layer that's up to us. It's all part of the interactive portion of the standard. And it allows us to do a lot of neat things. And the environment that we've created to help the broadcasters exploit that capability is called Run3 TV. It's provided free to broadcasters as part of our mandate. Without getting too deep into the weeds on here, there's a smart TV browser. It's technically called a user agent in ATSC 3, but it's a browser without a keyboard. Think of it that way. Standard HTML browser. The standard that drives that is A344, and there's a whole bunch of things explained in A344 that it tells you what you can and cannot do. But there's also APIs in the receiver, and an API in a receiver allows you to do things like figure out what channel you're on, or to turn the volume up or turn the volume down, or squeeze the picture down, or there's over 100 APIs. But we've added APIs in the Run3 platform as well to do other things. Add, subtract, run different encode decoders, run different transport types, and so forth. And we provide that in the Run3 platform to allow the receiver, take the load off the receiver, and to also make the difference between the different receiver manufacturers in the way they implement the user agent or browser, so that it appears if you move from one room with an LG to another room with a Samsung, that the interactive runtime looks the same, or the application looks the same. This is an example where hitting the right arrow on your remote control would bring up the first way on the left, where it says NBC app, and then DVR, Explorer, Guide, Alerts, Weather. That would come up first, and if you hit the arrow again, the next menu would come out, and that's an overlay, and it's transparent only on the right-hand side, so it appears to be on top of what's underneath, which in this particular case is NBC news programming. And you can navigate with your arrow keys on your remote control, select one of those, and go from there. And then you're in kind of an HTML environment over what's going on behind the screen. You could have chosen to squeeze in the program to squeeze what you're seeing on the screen down, but that's all in editorial choices. It also can do other things like lower thirds. It can do what in the business is called paper clips, or promotional things in the corner. I don't know if you've ever seen where people will walk out on the screen and give a promotion. That can be done. It's all in the magic of the imagination of the programmer, what is possible. And by the way, I should say this interactive runtime can either be delivered over the air or can be delivered over broadband, because as you well know, almost every smart TV is connected to broadband. In fact, I don't know of a modern TV that you don't turn on that doesn't plug the daylights out of you to connect it to broadband as quickly as possible, because they want to update the receiver. They want to have the ability to have access to the receiver to update it. And we find that these receivers are receiving updates probably once or twice per year. So it is true. That's it for me. And I'm going to throw it over to Skip. And then I think at the end, we're going to have a question and answer period. So
Yeah,
Skip?
I think that's a good plan. I think we'll do questions and answers at the end. So I got a bunch of them. So these guys probably have some too. So go ahead, Skip.
All right. I think Dave has to get off the share for me to be able to get on. That's what Zoom is telling me. But hi, everyone.
Here you go.
Great job, Dave. That's an amazing amount of coverage in a short amount of time. And I'll try to, like say, fill a few more areas up with some of the issues. What you hopefully didn't miss in Dave's comprehensive presentation is the fact that we've got this new technology, and that's one thing. But on top of that, we have this challenge of no spectrum with which to deploy it, and that's a peculiarly American issue. We talked about all the other countries. In Korea, they did give new spectrum to the broadcasters, and so they're doing what broadcasters did in the US last time we did a transition from analog to digital, where we had 2 channels to work with for a period of time, a good period of time, many years, and then a schedule by which we would then shut down the old service, sunset the legacy analog, and only be on digital. And then, of course, the FCC was then able to take that spectrum that was freed up and auction it off to wireless to the tune of some $20 billion into the federal coffers, helped the budget balance the budget back in the Clinton days. That seems so long ago. Anyway, we have no more spectrum to squeeze out. They've already done another auction since then, where all they did was rearrange and repack the spectrum. So now that we're trying to do 3.0 transition, broadcasters that is, there's no spectrum to give a second channel out. And so the FCC has set up a way to do this, but because there's no spectrum to convert, or rather to use in the to resell, basically, there's no impetus or urgency for the FCC to make this happen on any kind of a schedule, or in any way make it mandatory. So it's a voluntary transition for broadcasters. They can do it if they want, when they want, which is great. That's convenient. And so there's some benefits to broadcasters and to cable for doing that. But the fact is that we have to do it through our own use of our own spectrum. And Dave showed you that channel sharing model, the so-called lighthouse, where the typical example, there's 5. It's, as you mentioned, in Louisville, it's 6 stations will get together and do that channel sharing. We call it reciprocal channel sharing, because one of those 6 stations or 5 stations becomes a 3.0 service, which means that, of course, its services are no longer visible to their legacy receivers, which is, of course, all the receivers, pretty much all the receivers right now, although you saw the uptick in what we expect 3.0 receivers to look like in the next few years, to the point where we hope that, by the latter half of this decade, all TVs will be 1.0, 3.0 capable. And so consumers will have those TVs, whether they ask for them or not. And that will allow all the broadcasters to shut down eventually the 1.0 service. But that's not on anybody's roadmap. Well, at least it doesn't have a date on anybody's roadmap yet. That is the sort of end goal. And so this lighthouse model has the advantage, has some advantages, and the FCC rules had to be changed to accommodate this ability for broadcasters to share their spectrum. This is kind of almost a European style model where broadcasters in a lot of broadcasters, most broadcasters in Europe nowadays have some third party do the RF delivery. They just worry about the content. And in the US and in many, I would say most other regions, broadcasters still control both their content and their delivery services themselves. They all have their own antennas. Sometimes there's combiners in some markets to the actual antenna, but they all have their own transmitters anyway. And so these new rules allow a broadcaster to take another broadcaster's content, put it on their transmitter, but still have the responsibility for the content be held by the originating broadcaster. So that's a new model, and that took some doing and changing the rules, where we had always had a broadcaster has their own content, their own RF transmission. It's all one-to-one. Now we have this ability to mix and match. And it's kind of like having an embassy in a foreign country, in the sense that, the conceit is that land that the embassy occupies is actually land of the the embassy's country, even though it exists in the foreign country physically. So that's how that's kind of working now. So, and again, this is peculiar to the U.S.'s transition model. Has nothing to do with ATSC 3 per se. It's not in the standards. This is a whole regulatory layer on top of the actual technology standard. So the rules are that if you do this kind of overlap where you move your signal from your original station, when you switch to 3.0, your 1.0 signal must, for your main service only, by FCC rules, the new rules, must move to one of the other stations that you're working with. And the coverages of those two stations, you must have pretty much the same coverage that you had yourself when you put your signal over to the other station. And if you don't, there's all these rules about how you have to provide tuner set-top boxes on demand to the homes that want them, and so on. So, but for cable, the idea is that, as Dave said, you've got a 90-day advance alert that a given station is moving its main service to another station's actual transmitter. So it'd be a .2 or a .3 or something on one of those other stations. So it'd be act like a multicast service, which typically cable companies don't necessarily carry from broadcasters. So this is something where you have your .1 from each of the stations in the market that you either have carriage through must carry rules, or more typically, at least for commercial stations, through a retrans agreement. And now you're maybe going to be getting more than one service, main service from one of the stations with this network affiliation and so forth, from a separate, a single station. So instead of just getting the main service from each of the stations, you'll be getting at least one other service from the 3.0 Lighthouse service station from one of the other stations on a .2 or some other multicast. So this is what the notification to MVPDs is about by broadcasters. Broadcasters that make their moving, they're moving one of their that are turning a signal, one of their stations in that market into 3.0. The service, at least the main service from that station, will be moving over to another station. And then in turn, that 3.0 station will carry all of those participating stations in that group that Dave showed you, because a ATSC3 service can handle, between the additional efficiency in the RF encoding and the new codec, which is 2 generations better than the one we're using in 1.0, where we used MPEG-2 video, we're now using MPEG HEVC, that gives you about 4 to 5 times the capacity. So a 3.0 service can handle a lot more, and that's where the 5 comes in. You can really carry a good bit more on the 3.0. So the 3.0 has no trouble getting multiple stations carried on one stick, but the other way around is hard because the 1.0 encoding doesn't give you a lot of room. And so trying to squeeze the main service, and in some cases, even the multicast services from that station that went 3.0 into the other service stations, 1.0 signals, is the trick. And that's the sort of Rubik's Cube that we're working with in these multiple markets. Now, I will mention low power television may play a big role here in the future because low power TVs don't have to put their original services. If a low power TV went to 3.0, there's no requirement for what it was broadcasting in 1.0 to be carried anywhere else. And so the 3.0 is kind of an ollie in-free 3.0 signal on LPTV with no reciprocal carriage requirement. And LP isn't so LP in 3.0 because low power actually gets you further, as Dave was pointing out sort of in his slides, that and so it's not a bad idea. And as a result, low power TV licenses have started to increase in price because there is a perceived new value to them in this transition scheme that we have to go through. So look at that in a second. But so the advantage of these 5 or 6 stations on a lighthouse is that you can say, hey, the market's transitioned, and you got all the networks, usually maybe some independent stations as well, that have all gone 3.0. They're still broadcasting all their content in 1.0 to the market. And so, but you can say that market's converted. Well, that's the advantage of being able to get it up there quick. But the downside is that eventually what you'd like to do is have all those stations one by one go to 3.0 and get it down to where there's only one, the so-called nightlight station, still broadcasting all of the 1.0 services in the market. However, as you said, 1.0 can't carry that many signals, certainly not in HD. So that's the downside to this approach. And getting beyond one or maybe 2 of those stations going into 3.0 is difficult. Now, there's schemes that you could mitigate this by saying, well, we're only going to do the main services. We won't carry all the multicasts over the air, but that's not a very helpful approach. Now, the FCC is looking like it's okay if you wanted to use ABC, that codec in between the 2 generations that we talked about. Most TVs that for the last 5 years or more have that in there, and they just kind of work if you put ABC on the air. Right now, the FCC is not really, is kind of looking the other way if you want to do that for your multicast, but they don't allow it explicitly for the main services. So main services must remain MPEG-2 video. The other trick you could do is turn your HD down to SD, or eventually you hope for the next set of rule changes, not maybe the next one, but some future rule change, because this will be something that will be changed over time every few years. They're looking at it. They're about to make a new set of rules right now for the first revision of these new transition rules. And at some point they'll say, okay, you don't have to do the 1.0 simulcast anymore. And we don't know when or what the provisions of that will be, but that will eventually happen, we hope. And then everybody can go back to carrying their own stuff in 3.0, and all this channel sharing stuff will go away. Or maybe not, maybe it'll stick around in a different way. But there is another way to do this. Instead of putting one big 5-station cluster or more than one of those in some of the big markets, in small these large groups of stations, you could do a one-on-one, what I call dance partner approach, where you just took 2 stations. And so this is kind of a corollary to Dave's slide where he showed the 5 stations and how they would sort out all their services. Here's 2 stations that just would get together and say, we each have an HD primary, and one of the stations has a couple of SD multicasts. One of them has an HD multicast. Maybe it's a market where a station is carrying 2 networks. That happens in medium, small markets. And so what happens, let's say station B goes 3.0. It still carries its own stuff, but it carries the other station stuff in 3.0, and conversely, the other station stays 1.0 station A and carries station B's stuff as multicast services. And so now they're loaded up in 1.0 with 3 HDs and 3 SDs. And in testing that we've done, that's about as much as you can get on a 3.0, on a 1.0 signal. So that works okay. And this, of course, gives this station a lot more than the station that went 3.0. There's plenty of room to do other stuff with in the meanwhile during this transitional period. And that can be experimental service, it could be data casting, it could be revenue producing, they could be more other video services and so on. But the fact is that the cable service would now get its 1.0 signals for both stations off the air of channel 27 here. Now, in many cases, you'll have your primary feed will be actually coming through a fiber or some sort of IP or other connection, and the backup is the over the air. But still need this 90-day notice that this service here from station B is now going to be over here on station A as a multicast, and that's where you're going to be having at least your backup pickup for your cable service. And then depending on your arrangements, you may be carrying some of these other multicasts as well. But often, at least by rule, typically it's just the primary services that are being carried on the commercial stations. Public stations have a different setup. Public stations, as you may know, have an agreement between NCTA, the Cable Industries Trade Association, and APTS, the Association of Public Television Stations, where up to 4 services are carried through must carry. There is no retrans in public TV. So it's just still going through the old must carry rules. And those by agreement, you may be carrying up to 4 services from any public TV station. So that gets more complicated because then you do have to worry about what happens to the multicast. And that's actually why public TV is not included in a lot of these lighthouses so far, and it's trying to come up in those markets with its own approach to doing this. Here's another, and here's what ends up happening at the end. Obviously, everybody goes back to 3.0, and this would work in all those lighthouse scenarios or dance partner scenarios. And then you've got everybody back to carrying their own stuff, and they're at full power in 3.0, and what you get is these stations all end up with basically double the capacity. And this is why broadcasters want to do this, because ultimately they're getting another station's worth of capacity out of this by today's standards, by 1.0 standards, and as a metric. And then that would allow 4K kinds of services to be Ultra HD services, as well as because what today we're talking about in these other scenarios is up to 1080p, which is a lot better, particularly with the 4K up conversion that you see in the sets today, most of the sets today. And it looks really good. It does look a little better, even though it's still 1080 max lines, but it's progressive rather than interlace, and it can include HDR without a whole lot more bits, high dynamic range signals, that is, and eventually maybe even high frame rate signals, which is great for sports and other kind of high motion content. Anyway, after the transition, you'll have tons of capacity to do more of those fancier services, as well as add quantitatively more services, or do things like data casting and other kind of non-TV, non-traditional TV services through that broadcasters might want to get into, which wouldn't affect cable much at all. And plus the fact that these broadcasters can also be sending content out, either enhancement content or completely separate content on broadband with 3.0. 3.0 is really a hybrid broadcast broadband service. And again, that too wouldn't affect cable. Cable would only be carrying the over-the-air part. And when it goes to 3.0, we're still not sure how the cable would, and this is something that broadcasters and cable will be working on together through SCTE and ATSC, as to how 3.0 signals are carried in in the future cable systems. Right now, though, we have a document, and look at briefly in a second, that Dave mentioned, that says or recommends, ATSC recommends how to convert a 3.0 signal into a legacy MVPD environment in the interim. So we'll look at that momentarily, but I did want to point out this low power example. If a station happens to be a low power station, it has different rules here, as I mentioned. And so two stations, a full power and a low power in this case, could get together in the same sort of example we showed before. And you would not have to carry the station A is staying in 1.0 would not have to carry the station B's services, which they could keep doing in 3.0 only. But given the fact that a lot of low power stations are just running syndicated content that they're paying for, costs them money to run, if they're no longer on the air in 1.0, that would mean that if they had cable carriage before, they wouldn't anymore. So they might want to just say, well, even though they would have more spectrum to do other stuff with, there's not a lot of receivers out there yet. They could just say, you know what, we're going to stop spending the money on this service, and our new business model will be, we're a lighthouse. The low power stations, basically, if there would be a financial arrangement between these two, or this station A could buy this low power TV station, use it during the transition, and then after the transition, have a whole new station. During the transition, they'd have a lot of spectrum because they're only carrying other stations' content, one or more, and then afterwards, you've got this huge new 4 or 5x capacity of the old station to do anything you wanted with, either the LP owner who has sort of rented out his station in the interim, or station A bought the station B and now has this other station in the market that they can do with within certain duopoly rules and so on that they could manage with a low power station. So there's a lot of options there, but in any event, not all the low power stations are carried by cable, but in those cases where they are, this is yet one more thing. You may actually see some services actually go off the air as the LP station becomes part of the 3.0 over the air transition. And what could those stations do with those? This is just a quick list of all the things that a broadcaster could do, some of which would end up being carried by cable, we hope, in the future, but in the meanwhile might just be delivered as a sidecar kind of service, particularly in terms of the things that are done with the broadband hybrid arrangement that 3.0 broadcasting can provide. Now, in terms of how a station would, in the meanwhile, or rather a cable system, MSO would handle the 3.0 feed. This is a table, the first real basic table in the A370 recommended practice. And it shows you how the 3.0 feed is composed, how this would be sort of a block diagram of an IRD, an integrated receiver decoder that like you use today to take 1.0 signals off the air. Well, this would be a 3.0 version of it. And there are conformance rules and so forth being developed to make sure these devices work properly. And then basically at the end, you come back to an MPEG-2 transport stream. Notice ATSC3 does not use MPEG-2 transport at all. It is a pure IP system. There are two IP transport options. Root, as Dave mentioned, root dash as it's called, or MPEG media transport, MMT. Most broadcasters are using the root today, but MMT is in the standard. It can be used, and pretty much all the equipment supports both. In any event, they're both IP-based, unidirectional IP-based services, and then this kind of shows you all the conversions that would take place. And meanwhile, you still have the 1.0 service as a backup in the for at least for the main channel for during the transitional period. So that's one thing. And then a little more conceptual, showing you how the the conversion would take place, and what this is a little easier to kind of figure out. It's more a concept rather than an actual block diagram. But it shows you how these signals would come out to the different kinds of cable services. This document's about 50 or 60 pages long, and it goes into pretty good detail on all the components here and how this works. Another big change in 3.0 is the captions are not burned into the video. They are a separate data stream and have to be transmitted that way, and then display encoded into the display, the video display. And so that's another whole component that works much more like the web video, like OTT captions do. In fact, it's using the same standard of captioning language that's used in the internet world. And so again, trying to make broadcasting more internet-like with IP transport, with IMSD1 captions, with what's not really shown here is the application environment, the HTML shell that Dave talked about earlier. So this is really trying to make the broadcast more of a internet-like service. And in turn, since cable is doing basically the same thing, at least at the transport level, going to IP, then you'll see that the two probably have a nice convergence for the future when we're both at our respective next gens. But at least for now, this document A370 shows you how to work with a 3.0 signal into your legacy distribution environment. And a separate document that we expect to be developed in cooperation between SCTE and ATSC would say how you take the 3.0 service and put it into your next gen distribution signal, so that you basically can retain a lot of this stuff and you wouldn't have to have all these conversions and re-encoding and so forth. So it actually, we hope, will be simpler in the future, but this document at least defines how it's done now. And so I'll leave you with some of those same references. This is the link to that standard. The link to NextGen TV has some general information there. And if you wanted to get into the other standards, the one I'd recommend starting with is A300. I don't have a link to it here, but you'll find it here, which is the sort of introductory overarching document. That's one that I'm the editor for, and it kind of explains how 3.0 works in the beginning, and then gives the normative references to all the other documents that make up the full standard in their current version. And we update that at least once a year. Usually comes out around April of each year, the new version, and it lists all the latest versions of the other documents. But as I say, the intro of that explains a little bit more about how all the pieces come together for ATSC 3. I'll reiterate, because it's worth it repeating, Dave's host station manual is probably the Bible right now for broadcasters anyway, to understand how to put a station on the air with 3.0 and to deal with this regulatory complexity we have with doing it without new spectrum, and a kind of a voluntary transition. And then, of course, the NAB has a number of resources, a lot of papers on 3.0 over the last few years, probably more coming up at this spring show in April and in Vegas. And then a consulting firm called Mintel, Strignoli and Wallace MSW has been doing some road shows with NextGen TV training, and so for those that are really interested in that, that's something you can see if they're coming to a town near you at some point in the future, and get some of their resources as well. So now I think if we got time, we can take some questions from the group.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, so I'll just open it up to the floor here. Anybody else out here have a question that they want to get started with? A lot of our folks here in the room, Skip and Dave, are field technicians. We have some others that are more administrative and managerial folks here. So I think our field technicians are probably wondering where the rubber meets the road. What difference is this going to make to them when they're out talking to the consumer in their home? So maybe let's start with that. One of the questions that I have, if I can open up my phone now and see what my questions were. All right. So what is the consumer going to notice about ATSC 3?
Well, I'll start with that, but Dave, I'm sure has some ideas too. That if they're watching over the air, the big difference will be if they have a 3.0 receiver, which I assume is what you're implying in the question. They would see a different look and feel potentially up to the broadcaster on their screen. The ability to have these interactive applications that Dave showed some examples of. And of course, the menu of services and the configurability of their service. This is a concept called enhanced broadcasting by some, or personalized broadcasting in some cases. Sounds like an oxymoron, right? Broadcasting is implicitly one to many, meaning everybody gets the same thing. But with the broadcast broadband hybrid capability and the interactivity layer that 3.0 gives you, the common content can go to everybody. That's the straight audio video captions, if you want the captions on or off. And then you can have other services that the app can allow a individual user to either expose or turn off. And that can come over the air with the other signals, main AV caption signals, or it can come through the broadband. Or both at once. You can have different services on, and you have this whole menu of additional enhanced services that the user can choose to configure. Different dialogue languages, different caption languages, and of course the ability to interact with the content, play along with the game, sports betting, you name it. So there's a lot of new capabilities that they would see if the broadcaster were providing them in 3.0, and assuming they had a 3.0 receiver they wanted to enable to look at those or expose those additional services. That's the first thing. A lot of the other changes are under the hood, unnoticeable. Higher video quality, we hope, would just happen. Higher audio quality with the codec. Obviously, a greater efficiency allows you to have more services, so more than 3 or 4 multicasts in a channel. And then the whole IP backbone allows a lot of this interactivity and the ability to retrans through the home Wi-Fi, making any IP device, tablets, phones, whatever, be able to, through an app, control what's called the home gateway that's got the tuners in it, multi-tuners, and an antenna, but then allows that redistribution throughout the home through the home Wi-Fi. So that's IP, the fact that it's IP really wouldn't be obvious, but it allows that kind of thing to happen very easily. And so again, the convergence, finally, true convergence of much more of an internet type experience to the TV over time, gradually. That's what we expect the user to notice the most. Remember when 1.0 came out, we didn't really have the internet. Since then, internet has pervaded everyone's lives, both in the computer and now even in the TV. Every TV today has an RF input and an IP input, right? An Ethernet or Wi-Fi input. And typically today, people switch between them to go over the air, over the top, or cable, MVPD, or through HDMI from an outboard box to the IP input. Maybe that's an outboard box too, like a Roku or Fire Stick or something on top of that. But we switch between those. What ATSC3 brings, and we assume this will happen just in general, is the ability for these new TVs to mix both of those inputs and take content simultaneously from both. And again, the user wouldn't know what's coming from where. They just have the menu of services that were available to them. And assuming they're connected and have a IP service as well as TV service through either an MVPD or an antenna, then they get both. They get all those services, and they can enable or disable whichever ones they want. So that's, I think, the kind of a long answer, but that's the eventual impact and difference that we'll see. And it won't be overnight. It'll be more of a gradual transition, as I expect. Dave, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, you did a good job of covering it. I think, Skip, just one of the things I want to mention is oftentimes we in television tend to ignore some of the audio features. And when we did some audience research, and we actually have done 2 layers, one before NextGen came out, and we had prototype sets to show to audiences. And then after now that it's launched and we have enough people familiar with it, brought in another audience and saw what their reactions were to the various features. And without exception, in both cases, you would have thought they would have said, well, bigger pictures and more efficiency and better quality and all of that. But it came down to some of the audio features like dialogue enhancement, which it isn't just for the hearing impaired. It could be in a household with a lot of children screaming around and you can't hear what the dialogue is going on, or a football game in which you can't hear what the commentator is saying because of the background noise. So the user has the ability to control the level of dialogue enhancement, and that comes along with the system, and it's part of Dolby's AC4. Also, the consistency of audio. Audio leveling has always been a problem in digital television from day one. And it's still a problem in ATSC1, despite a number of changes along the way, including the COM Act. That is included in AC4. It's deep in the balls of how it works. And so therefore, it's not going to be as big a problem in terms of audio leveling. And it's twice as efficient as the old AC3, older AC3, so that it provides more bandwidth and the ability to carry more versions of the services pointed out by Skip. And lastly, it's immersive. It can make use of what's known as imaging for those who are audiophiles. We're all used to the multiple channels, and that's one way of dealing with it. A train goes across in front of you and you hear it in the left speaker and it moves over to the right speaker. But imaging is more sophisticated in that it has the ability to control positions in between those 2 speakers in terms of the way it appears to or presented to the viewer. And we hear that imaging all the time in the movie theaters and have gotten used to it. And it's even now used in the sound bars many of us use. Those make heavy use of imaging. But this is actually built into the standard itself, so that movie theater-like experience is really included. So long story short, audio is a big part of it as well, beyond being able to pick other audio sources. The quality of the audio is significantly better and tested extremely well. In fact, it actually tested higher than the difference in the video, which they took for granted. But they didn't take the changes in the audio for granted, which was interesting to hear.
That 3D sound is another term for it too, Dave. What it enables. We went from in analog TV, we went from mono to stereo. Some of us may remember that. And then when we went to digital HSC1, we added the ability to go for include both stereo and surround, 5.1 surround, which really defines. So we went from defining a point to a line to a plane, and now in 3.0, the immersive or 3D sound allows a complete spherical representation with either speakers in the ceiling or speakers on the floor that with an upward firing element, or these sound bars that do a pretty good job with immersive. Even if you don't have to sit in exactly one spot, you can spread out across the couch and still get a pretty good immersive sound. And we never think about sound coming from above, but in real life, a lot does. And I'm amazed how much more realistic, what a great amount of realism and suspension of disbelief and everything else that comes when you add some height information. You wouldn't think it would make that much difference, but it really does. So looking forward to a really improved sound experience over TV as well, without a lot more bits at all, because the AC4 encoding is very efficient.
Yeah.
One question I have too, and again, guys here in the room, if you think of anything, just raise your hand so I can, and I'll have you ask it and then I'll repeat it so they can hear. A lot of cable operators serve very rural markets.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, Siri, shush. A lot of broadcasters or a lot of cable operators serve very rural markets. And if they are relying on over-the-air transmissions to then retransmit on their system, I'm just curious, will the transmission signal have a more limited distance under 3.0 than they do than 1.0? In other words, will that TV signal go as far as it does now?
Yeah, I can take that one. If you remember the charts I showed you in terms of being able to trade bandwidth for transmission quality, if you will, or transmission receivability is a more correct term. The receivability in 1.0 versus 3.0 in the tests that have been made show about a 2 to 3 dB improvement, meaning that on equal reception capability, equal amount of power, same antennas, we gain the equivalent of about 3 dB improvement using ATSC3, and it mainly comes as a result of, if you remember, I talked about the LDCP coding or forward error correction that's used in ATSC3. A little of it comes from the CFDM as well, but mostly comes from the improved coding, which allows us to gain that much more. The knee has now been pushed out in the knee in the curve. As you know, in digital television of all types, you go out so far, and then when you run out of forward error correction, it just falls off the edge and you have no reception. It isn't graceful in terms of its failure rate. So having that extra 2 or 3 dB makes it, yes, exactly right. So it'll cliff right off and the knee in the curve. But the long story short is, I don't think you'll see a degradation in your ability to receive the signal. I think quite the opposite. All things being equal, you should have an improvement by a good 3 dB worth of equivalent coverage.
And the best news of that, on that front, when you're dealing with a broadcaster and it's MVPD taking a signal off the air, in 1.0, you either got it or you didn't, and you need to move your antenna, transmit or receive antenna typically at the head end if you weren't getting the signal properly. With 3.0, there's a dial you can turn for the forward error correction versus payload. And so a broadcaster could work in cooperation with an MVPD and say, look, if you're not getting this signal, well let's try dialing our payload back a little bit and cranking up the error correction, see if that makes a difference. So you have variability. And interestingly, we didn't really talk much about this concept called PLPs, physical layer pipes. on a single broadcast, a 6 megahertz channel, which, as we said, at least during the transition, may be carrying a number of the primary station signals from that market that the cable head end needs to get. You can put them each on separate PLPs and adjust them independently. So you can have one of your video audio signals streams operating at a higher bit rate payload and lower error correction, and versus another one where you did it the other way. You put more error correction and less payload. So they're independent within a single RF coverage. You can have basically higher or lower receivability. And in fact, the 3.0 is such a basic state-of-the-art OFDM implementation that people have been amazed at the reception improvements and efficiency, not just in terms of how much stuff you can get in the 6 megahertz, but how far out it goes, how well it's received, even with like a not so high end antenna, one of these little flat panel window or wall antennas rather than a Yagi in the attic, for example. So it should actually be good news for MVPDs that get their signal, even their primary signals off the air, that 3.0 will actually be a lot easier to receive by them.
I want to just mention one other thing, particularly for the rural carriers that generally have to totally depend on over the air. We have implemented in virtually every market the delivery of the content between the organizations that are partnering up, making use of standard broadband, using the ability to use advanced forward error correction. The reliability has been amazing, and the cost benefit of using broadband for delivery of the service for these primary signals, and that could also work equally well for a delivery to our rural locations, where delivery via microwave or by a dedicated fiber is not really affordable, but it would be in a broadband delivery, because the payload of these things, generally speaking, is under 30 megabits per second. That's not a big deal, and the direction is download in the case of the cable. And we have yet to have a major failure in any one of the 60 markets that are on so far using broadband delivery of content between the partners. And there's a couple that are using microwave, but almost everybody else is using broadband, and it's been amazingly reliable.
Would that be something that say a rural operator, if they wanted to move to broadband delivery of that signal, they would just essentially reach out to the engineering departments at the stations and figure that out?
Right. Yeah, and it has to be encrypted as it goes across the broadband, because of course it's open to everybody, and there's a rights issue regarding picking up by anybody else, but that's implicit. There's a number of available encryption methodologies that are really almost no cost, as that SRT and others that are used commonly, that make it very, very affordable. And so yeah, it's a great delivery method. I thought I had mentioned it. It's not part of ATSC, but it's part of the revolution in technology that we're all benefiting from. Great.
Well, hey, gentlemen, we want to thank you for your time today. We're pretty much fresh out of time, unless we have any other questions here in the room. We do not. So thank you so much for joining us and giving us a little education about this topic. I'm sure there'll be more to come, and I know I've got a whole lot of questions that we don't have time for, so I'll probably just email those to you offline. So thank you very much for joining us for the training.